The 20th century writer and mystic Douglas Harding wrote quite a number of books and gave quite a number of workshops in which he used the idea of seeing, using the visual sense, as a way into, or as an interpretation of, or as a way of understanding altered states of consciousness, particularly that altered state we sometimes call enlightenment, a kind of being one with everything, absolute unity of being, as Eugene de Killy referred to it. This sense that there is no disconnection between oneself and the world, non-duality. He's sometimes referred to as a practitioner of Neo-Advaita, which is, Advaita is also a Sanskrit term for non-duality. And traditionally, the achievement of Advaita, the achievement of non-duality and enlightenment, requires extensive training in meditative practices or some of the other contemplative practices. But Neo-Advaita, such as the kind that Douglas Harding practiced and taught, doesn't require any of that. It's a relatively quick, relatively painless and extremely Western way of, notionally at least, achieving that state of consciousness. His dominant method, as I mentioned, draws upon the idea of seeing and using one's visual sense. And his own report of how he came to this is extensive, well not extensively, it's beautifully written actually, in a book called On Having No Head, which I think was published in the early 60s by the Buddhist Society, I believe, actually. In that book he talks about a life-changing experience he had, I believe, as a young soldier working in the foothills of the Himalayas. He accounts of standing on a mountainside, looking out at the scene, and seeing it laid out there in all its sort of glowing and dazzling beauty. And he sees the hills in the distance, he sees the fields and the walls and the landscape in front of him coming right up to his shoes, right to his feet. And he sees his feet planted on the ground, equally material, as glowing and as real and as physically actual as the world itself. And he sees his legs and his torso and his hands and his arms, but he notices in a kind of strangely dissociated way that beyond his torso he kind of disappears. He can't see his body or his torso, which is so obvious, but it's obviously missed. And he comes to the conclusion that the idea that he has a head is something that he doesn't actually have first-hand experience of. Yes, of course, he's seen pictures of himself with a head, and he's seen all the other human beings around him seem to have heads, and he's seen mirrors in which there seems to be a figure which is like him in the body and which has this fleshy protuberance, as he calls it, stuck on the top. But he has no first-hand experience, no first-hand visual experience of having a head. This sort of strange, slightly surreal understanding or insight leads him to pursue that idea further. If he has no head, he says, what am I looking at here? He looks down and his body is dissolving and disappearing somewhere around the top of his chest. But it doesn't disappear into nothing. It sort of becomes the world. It becomes the visual field. It's beyond a certain point, the world opens out, and there is a world on top of his shoulders, if you like, in which he himself is also featured. It's a hard idea to get your head around, I think, but at the same time it does resonate. I'm looking around now and I'm seeing the world, and without too much effort I can produce that sensation that Harding is talking about, that this visual field is not out there, it's somehow part of my experience. He uses this initial insight extensively in his writings, and in workshops. He runs a series of research. He was a workshop. He died, unfortunately, about 2 years ago. but he used to run workshops, and people who picked up on his ideas also run workshops, in which this ability to see, that's the term I'm using extensively, this ability to use visual metaphors or certain interpretation of one's experience to guide one towards a state of non-identity is extensive. Extensive. So one is encouraged, for example, in those workshops, and they're referred to as experiments, which I think is very interesting, even though they're not technically scientific experiments. They have this sort of patina of objectivity, a first-person approach, actually not objectivity, that's not the right term, but it's a first-person phenomenological seriousness about it, which you take experience seriously, put oneself in a certain situation, allow oneself to look at certain things, and then try to believe the evidence of one's senses. In the same way that whilst we can't see our own head, and this really resonates actually with some of Drew Levitt's stuff that he writes about in The Absent Body, where we can't detect our own sensory organs directly, we're always absent from ourselves, we can't see ourselves. So we take that experience, that first-hand experience, seriously.